What's up, everybody? Welcome again to Stir Crazy, episode 35, the place to get your unvarnished take on the news. We may stumble over the words hither and thither, but we're still going to get the point across. This is that place where we talk real shit about the news, brought to you by the Real News Network. I'm your host, Kim Brown. Coming up on today's show, you guys really dictated today's topic a lot to us because we've been getting a lot of comments, a lot of feedback, people asking us the question, when are you going to address how the pandemic and the subsequent related calamities are impacting indigenous communities here in the U.S. and North America at large, I should say. Well, today is that day, everybody. We are focusing exclusively on the indigenous communities, Native American communities, how they are suffering, dealing with these ongoing challenges as it relates to COVID-19, how a lot of these challenges are historical, very much like other marginalized communities who are dealing with this. But of course, we know that Native Americans have been dealing with this since the advent, since the settlers first took step onto this raggedy country called America, and that's how I'm gonna call it. America is raggedy. It wasn't raggedy until the Europeans got here, but as soon as they got here, oh man, shithole nation instantly. So gang, of course, as usual, we want to take your comments and your concerns and your criticisms in the chat. We know you guys like to keep it all the way live, so if you have anything that you want to say in a nice, respectable way to either me or any of our guests, feel free to drop it in the comments. Our social media guy, James, will make sure that I see it, and we'll get you on the air in that way, okay? So today, time to bring in our fantastic, wonderful panel. Joining us from the DC area is Jen Deerinwater. Jen is a journalist. She's also a speaker and organizer. Johnnie Jae is on the line, also a journalist, advocate, and community builder. And Desiree Kane, she's from the Miwok Nation. She's a journalist and a community organizer. She's part of the Colorado Rent Strike and Eviction Defense and Missing Indigenous Sisters Tools Initiative, MISTY. We are so honored to have you all on the panel with us today, guys. So thank you so much for being here. So the first place we're going, all good, ladies. So the first place we're going to start actually is out in South Dakota, because as we know that there are a number of Native American reservations in South Dakota, and they have taken a very proactive step into trying to keep COVID-19 out of their communities. They have been setting up these roadblocks, basically telling white Americans, y'all can't come here, okay? Because y'all are carrying the COVID, and we don't want y'all in our neighborhood spreading the COVID. And the governor of South Dakota, has now decided that she wants to try to force tribal elders and leaders to forcefully open up Native American areas to prevent them from being able to block folks. So Jen, what is your take on what the preemptive step that these tribes took out in South Dakota?
Well, the first thing I want to point out is that they're not roadblocks, they're checkpoints. I think those are two very different things. So I think the checkpoints, one, it's well within the legal rights of tribal nations to do this. It's a part of our inherent sovereignty to self-governance and to rule over our lands and our people, just as the United States would not have the right to, say, go into France or Germany and tell them how they're supposed to react to this pandemic. They don't have that right to do that with our Native nations. And I'm actually working on a piece for the Real News Network that should be out anytime now, looking at these checkpoints and what's happening out there. The news is really focused on the checkpoints, the Cheyenne River Sioux and the Oglala Sioux tribes reservations. But I do know the Rosebud Sioux tribe also has a checkpoint. I actually spoke with someone from Governor Nome's office yesterday, and they said that they haven't taken legal action yet, but it sounds as if they may not be willing to back down. The governor released a letter on May 12th, I believe, for Cheyenne River and May 13th for the Oglala, basically saying, we don't think you're allowed to shut down state and U.S. highways or have any kind of checkpoint or interfere with any traffic crossing your reservation whatsoever, unless it's on a tribal road or a Bureau of Indian Affairs road. But that's just not correct. I mean, one, the tribes have a treaty right to decide who comes onto their lands. And there was also a court case in 1990, I believe it was the Eighth Circuit Court, ruled that tribes have the right to oversee U.S. and state highways that cross their lands. So legally, the governor doesn't really have a leg to stand on with this. And when you also look at how the coronavirus, how COVID-19 is impacting our Native people, it just makes sense that tribal nations take a proactive stance and try to limit the flow of traffic through their lands. I know that we'll get into this in more detail as we go on, and Johnnie and Desiree can definitely speak to this as well. But, the Navajo Nation, for example, they have the third highest rate of confirmed COVID-19 contraction rates in this country. And when you also look at the complete lack of testing, and as well as the labs and the supplies to process tests that many of our Native nations are suffering in our Indian health system and tribal ran and urban Indian health centers, we still don't even know accurate rates. So the rates of contraction that we have and the rates of death could be significantly higher than what we even know. Native people are often erased from data. So that's another issue that we have, particularly for those of us who are urban-based. We're being counted as other rather than as American Indian or Alaskan Native. So if you just look at the setup and the conditions that many of our people are living under, and how some governors, like Governor Nome, who never put a stay-at-home order in place, it just makes sense to me that tribes will do what they have to do to protect their people.
Johnnie and Desiree, I want to get your reaction because we do have a clip from Governor Nome. This is from a press conference she gave. I think it was Sunday, May 11th, just days before those letters were sent out, as Jen mentioned. So, but when you listen to this clip, I want you to sort of listen to the incredulity from the journalists who are asking the governor these very specific questions. And my take is she sounds like she's lying, but I want to hear what you guys' take is on this. Let's hear from South Dakota Governor Nome.
And are you hearing that that's not happening on either of the reservations? Because they both say that, they're allowing through traffic, they're allowing essential services. Ranching is considered a essential service, at least for the Oglala Sioux tribe. I mean, are you hearing that this isn't happening?
Yeah, I am getting reports from travelers, from businesses, ranchers in the area, and those within DOT and other state agencies that these checkpoints have been an issue with allowing those types of services to get through.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Hi, Governor Nome, this is Dominique Smith from News Center 1. How are you?
Good.
I have another question regarding the checkpoints.
Sure.
So what communication has the state had with the tribes? Because the tribes are saying that they have had some communication with the states, and they've been very clear about what they were going to be doing with these checkpoints. So what kind of discussions have been had, and what do you consider the tribes fulfilling the consultation that's needed to approve these plans?
Yes, we have had conversations with the tribes, and it's been ongoing, I would say, for approximately a month. Friday wasn't the start of the situation. It had been going on with several different conversations, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to come to a point where we can allow these types of services to move through these checkpoints and to get some decisions made as to how to go forward, because we need to continue to see those essential services move through the checkpoints. We need to be able to get ranchers to their cattle, people to their property, and to make sure that we're allowing people who want to travel through the area to continue to do so and not be stopped and turned around.
Desiree, I mean, from all accounts, I'm not sure, who to believe here, because at least according to those journalist questions, they made it sound as if though the tribal leaders are not impeding traffic, so to speak, or they're doing these checkpoints, but people are still allowed to traverse, I suppose, as they need to. But it sounds as though the governor has a very different take on this.
Yeah, Kristi Nome is a really kind of salacious character who was part of making riot boosting a thing, firstly, and then outlawing it, making it illegal, which basically was aimed at Indigenous people and stopping protests around fossil fuel extraction infrastructure projects like the Keystone XL. You said you're like, she seems incredulous, like she's lying. Her interest is in keeping America's wealth intact and make sure there are no impediments to capitalism. And the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe has long had very strong leadership with Chairman Fraser, their chairman, where they're allowed in their treaty rights to have a sovereign say over what happens with their land. And so with the jurisdictions, what's happening is not dissimilar to what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline fight. The states said that they had jurisdiction over these roads. These roads traverse treaty territory. The United States has not honored the tribes, the treaties signed with the tribes. There's like hundreds of them that have never been honored. And so, when I watch that, I just think Kristi is American, and America, the United States is built to eradicate Native people, especially if folks stand in the way. So she will lie, she will manipulate, but it's really important to understand that she is in place to keep America's wealth intact. And so oftentimes that means Native people, we say no, we get in the way of development. It's really unfortunate to see what some of the governors are doing. There seems to be a real system failure with how the governors are responding to the COVID-19 crisis. We've got issues in Colorado that are not dissimilar, where we've got a governor who is, in the pockets of the bank and their moneyed lawyers and the lobbyists more so than they're on the side of the people who put them in office and elect to keep them there.
Johnnie, the concern that I have is that if the tribes in South Dakota and other places, but I guess in this instance we're talking about the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe in South Dakota, if they continue to stand their ground, I'm worried about a militarized response, as what we saw during the Dakota Access pipeline protests, where people just their civil rights were disregarded, people were hurt, and there was no accountability from the state, because these folks said, no, this is our land, we do not want this to happen. Same thing is happening now. Do you think that the governor could marshal law enforcement against the people who are maintaining these checkpoints?
Absolutely. We are talking about the Navajo Nation, and they have one of the largest rates of infection in the U.S. right now. And what we're seeing there is they have similar checkpoints set up to monitor people coming in and out of their communities. But what you're seeing in Gallup is that they actually have called in the military to provide another checkpoint to make sure that, and it was actually, I wish I could remember this because I was just reading about this, but it was a specific act that the governor put in place. It's almost like a riot act, or I can't remember what it is, but they're actually blocking off access to Gallup. So Gallup is kind of quarantined. And the bad thing about this is the fact that a lot of the Navajo reservation need Gallup. They need to go there for supplies. So now they're being cut off from being able to access water, to access food. And, I'm not surprised that it happened. I'm not going to be surprised if you start seeing that same thing happen in North Dakota, South Dakota, and other places where natives are asserting their sovereign rights, because people are afraid of our sovereignty, mainly because they don't understand it. And even right now, in the Supreme Court, they're discussing whether or not a large portion of the Oklahoma is considered a reservation for the Muskogee Creek people. And one of the main concerns that keeps coming up is, well, how is this going to impact non-Native people? And this is where the fear comes. And I see this happening with these checkpoints, is a lot of people are afraid of Native people asserting their sovereign rights, because they think that we're trying to keep them out, trying to push them out, mainly because that's how they treated us. When they came in to take the land, they pushed us off. And so they kind of expect us to do that in turn, when that's not the case at all. And as far as the checkpoints themselves, I am in total agreement that tribes need to do this, not just the Navajo Reservation, not just in North Dakota, South Dakota, but all Native nations need to do this on a regular basis, whether there's a pandemic or not. We need to protect our communities, because it's not just a pandemic. We also have a large number of murdered and missing Indigenous women, and we don't have the right to prosecute non-Natives who commit crimes on reservations or in Native communities. So, I do think we need to set up checkpoints, make sure that we're checking who's coming in and out of our communities, and what their intent is when they do come into the community. And as far as the pandemic, what people really need to understand, and why these checkpoints are so essential right now, is that in the early 1900s, there was an estimated only 235,000 natives left in the entire US. And right now, our population stands about 5 million. And that's on a low estimate. And that's only considering people who are federally enrolled within their tribes. But even at 5 million, we're less than 2% of the entire US population. Our entire population could fit into just one metropolis here in the US, and that would be the Detroit metropolis area. Our entire population could fit in that one city. So we're a very small community. And so when you're seeing these numbers of rates of infection, what people need to understand is that those numbers look low when you're looking at tens of thousands in other communities, or tens of thousands of infections everywhere else. But you have to really look at the scale of our community compared to the scale of other communities. And also that when we lose somebody in our communities, we're not just losing a loved one, we're losing a huge chunk of our culture, our traditions, our language, our future. And when you look at the scale, one Native death, whether it's to COVID, whether it's to alcoholism or poverty, whatever the cause, regardless of the cause, one Native death would be the equivalent of 1,077 deaths if they just happened to die all at one time within the white community. It'd be like losing 143 people at one time in the Black community, or 61 at the same time in the Asian community, or 192 deaths in the Latino company. Imagine if that many people died all at once. That's the impact that it has when one Native person dies within our communities, because we're such a small population compared to other communities. And so you really have to look at that, because that's when you start to understand exactly how Native communities are being impacted by this pandemic. We are facing another, almost like an extinction level event. And this is something that we've had to fight, since America was founded, because that's the whole point of America, and the founding of it. It was built on genocide. It was built on slavery. It was built on the idea that we need to eradicate the Indian problem. And we've fought against that. We continue to fight against it. And now we're here with another pandemic. And, we just got our numbers up to 5 million. It took us almost over 100 years to get to 5 million. And here we are facing another event where our numbers could plummet back to 235,000. That's not an impossible, it's just not an impossible figure. Yeah, and it's so, you see people thinking, well, why are they doing these checkpoints? Why are they doing this? Well, that's because we have a lot to lose, and we've already lost a lot. And, we need to protect our communities.
You know, Johnnie, the emotion in the sentiment that you're expressing was shared by Navajo Nation President Jonathan Nez. He's been addressing Navajo Nation online, Facebook, YouTube. He held a town hall, virtual town hall yesterday. I think he was in New Mexico, and he had a similar emotional response to the loss of any Navajo life, let alone the amount that have been lost since the COVID-19 pandemic struck. So let's hear from President Nez.
Here on the Navajo Nation, we have tested about 8-9% of the total population of our citizens here. And compare that to the United States population. A little bit over 2% of the US population has been tested. So you can see the comparison. 8% of the total population here on Navajo have been tested. So we have been testing a lot. In the amount of 20,928 people have been tested. And total positive cases are 3,392. Negative cases, 15,809. And we have 119 of our Navajo citizens here who have lost their lives. One way too many. Last night, there was a big spike in positive cases and deaths. You know, a lot of people are fighting in the hospitals. Some are off the Navajo Nation fighting for their lives. They're strong. We're strong. And so yesterday we increased by 16 deaths. You know, those are all numbers from consolidation of those that are having a hard time in these border town hospitals who have passed away. And it's sad to me. You know, as you can tell, I'm pretty saddened by those numbers.
Jen and Desiree and Johnnie, anybody feel free to hop in. If you could contextualize President Jonathan Nez's comments right there at the end, where he talks about members of the Navajo Nation or you know, members of other communities within the Native American diaspora who have died in border town hospitals. I can only imagine he's making reference to I'm sure the immense amount of racism that Native Americans face when they leave the reservation and are out in the regular United States of America, where racism against non-white folks is very prevalent. But what can you put that into context? What he was referring to?
Well, we don't have access to healthcare. I know a lot of people think that, you know, we automatically have free healthcare, but the problem is we don't have access to healthcare. For a lot of our communities, you have to travel to get to an IHS center. Sometimes it's maybe 30 minutes. Sometimes it's 4 to 8 hours for some people, depending on where they're at. You know, IHS is part of our treaty rights. And from the very get-go, it's been underfunded. And now we're looking at this pandemic, and we're still a very underfunded in terms of healthcare. We have our healthcare facilities that are doing the best they can with what they have. And, you know, it's so sad to me because I'm here in LA and we don't have an IHS center here in LA. We have there's a nonprofit, United American Indian Involvement, who runs a small clinic here, and they service the Native community for all of LA County. And if it wasn't for this one small nonprofit being able to provide that clinic, a lot of natives here in LA would go without health care. Even in light of this pandemic, they're making sure that they're providing breakfast, they're making sure they provide lunch. But in terms of healthcare, they're just a very small clinic. They don't have hospital beds. They don't have any means to take in patients. So natives here really don't have anywhere to go except for, hospitals are in the area. And, if you don't have healthcare, if you don't, fit their criteria of, what they deem as serious symptoms of COVID, then you're sent home. And for a lot of natives, it's a very uncomfortable to go into these facilities in the first place, knowing you don't have healthcare, or knowing that, they don't necessarily see you as a human being. People have already had bad experiences. I've been here in LA for 2 years, and I have lupus. And last year, I woke up paralyzed and needed to go to the ER, and it was a terrible experience. And the way that they treated me was as if I was a drug addict, and that, that I was just kind of trying to get drugs, and I was paralyzed. And, they just totally dismissed me, and they almost cost me my life. They just doped me up. They gave me morphine, even though I told them not to give me morphine. They didn't take any account, any of my symptoms or the fact that I have lupus, and they sent me home. And I could barely even walk at that point. I had just been able to regain being able to move, and they sent me home. So I know firsthand that when you go into a healthcare facility, as a Native person, that, a lot of times your humanity is not going to be respected or even acknowledged. You're just going to be treated as somebody who's there to get drugs or, to get a free meal, and they send you on your way. And that's what the Native Americans are facing when we talk about medical racism. And so now you have this pandemic where our IHS facilities are very underfunded. We don't have easy access to them because a lot of people don't have transportation. They don't have gas money. And they're also very, a lot of them are very traumatized by past experiences that they've had in medical centers. And so, it really puts us in a very precarious situation in terms of how do we get the care that we need during this time. And, my heart goes out to the Navajo reservation because a lot of their communities are so rural. And I can absolutely see why this is having the impact that it does. And it's heartbreaking because a lot of these deaths could be preventable if we had better access to healthcare, if we had access to the resources that we need in order to protect us even before we get infected. A lot of people on the Navajo reservation, they don't have running water, they don't have electricity, and they depend on going into these border towns in order to get the resources they need. But now in places like Gallup, they're being disconnected from that. And also with the stay-at-home orders, a lot of the essential businesses that we do have been raided by other non-natives coming into our areas. And so, that puts us in a very precarious situation. And, I honestly, as optimistic as I want to be, I just don't see a silver lining right now for us unless we get the resources that we need. And even the funding that has been set aside for us through the CARES Act, we have a lot of our communities haven't seen that money yet. And so, we're just trying to make do and do the best that we can right now. But at the same time, we're seeing so many of our people dying and getting sick and not getting the care that they need. And it's absolutely angering and just so frustrating because at the end of this, I just keep thinking, what is going to be left of our communities? And, how are we going to recover from this?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Johnnie just said. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, which is the largest federally recognized tribal nation in the so-called U.S. And we have 370,000 citizens for Cherokee Nation, which is significantly more than some of our tribal nations that, maybe just have a few thousand. We are a little better resourced than some of the other tribal nations as well, but I still worry for my people. 370,000 that's really not a lot of people. The first person that died of COVID-19, at least it was a confirmed case in my home state of Oklahoma, was a Cherokee Nation citizen. One of the people that we lost is an elder who spoke our language. That's a big part of this as well, is it's not just the loss of our life, it's the loss of our languages and our culture, much of which the United States and previous colonizers tried to take from us, because it's important to remember that, yes, the U.S. these are the assholes that have stuck around the longest. But, we had plenty of other white nations coming in here. My people had to deal with the Spanish and the French. Other people had the Dutch, the Portuguese, So we've been going through just one colonizer after another trying to kill us. And when they couldn't literally kill us, they went after our culture. They made it illegal to do our ceremonies. They stole our children from us and put them in boarding schools. And that was not that long ago. We still have boarding school survivors to this day. Those children were beaten and had horrible things done to them. Their hair was cut. They were given Christian names. They were abused if they spoke their languages. I only know a couple of words in my language. And that's something that I had to actually learn as an adult. So when we're losing our people, sorry, it's just getting to me. When we lose anyone, that is such an enormous loss as Indigenous people. And also just speaking to being under-resourced. So the IHS, I think a lot of people in the United States and probably in Canada and other areas, they have this idea that, Indians, quote, Indians get all this free stuff. But what they don't realize is that that's not free. Our treaty right to healthcare, that we paid for that in blood. We paid for that with our land, for our people. That is our right that we negotiated in those treaties. And what people need to understand is that the United States in its early days almost went bankrupt. They did not have the money and the resources to go to war with all the Indigenous people. And that's part of why they did treaties. It's infuriating to me. And I think, the racism that I've experienced as a Native person looks a little different when I go back home to Oklahoma or in other area that has more recognizable Native populations than what I experience on the East Coast where I currently live. But by no means do I not experience it here. I have had so many problems in healthcare settings. The George Washington University Hospital, I had back surgery there in 2017. I literally had my spine, basically ripped open and had metal and things put in it. And the white nurses were refusing me the pain medication that the doctors prescribed me. And so it goes back to that, well, you're just an Indian, so you must just be a drug seeker. You're faking it. You're lying. I got called a redskin. I had people, nurses and staff coming into my hospital room calling me a redskin. This stuff is still happening. It's 2020 and this is happening to us every day. And that impacts every part of our lives. There are times unfortunately, I'm chronically ill and multiply disabled, so I have to see a lot of doctors. But there have been times where I've canceled medical appointments because I'm just like, I don't have it in me to face just the barrage of bullshit that could come my way today. And it gets exhausting. And, 71% of us are actually urban based. Not all tribal nations have reservations. Mine does not. We maybe could again, depending on the court case that Johnnie mentioned earlier. But most of us live in cities now, and that's from the 1950 termination era when the United States basically wanted to end the government to government relationship that we have, and they relocated a lot of us to cities. Well, if you go east of the Mississippi, there are very few federally recognized tribes, and so there are very few services for us. I live in Washington, D.C. We have a high population of Native people who live here and travel here on a regular basis, but we don't have any urban Native health centers. Baltimore has a very, very small one, but that's in Baltimore, and they don't even have primary care, healthcare there. So this whole COVID-19 pandemic, it's just a lot. And I think it really brings up a lot of the trauma issues that we have as well, the historical and intergenerational trauma, thinking about my own people who died in large numbers from smallpox. And
that's what I was thinking, Jen. I mean, to me, looking at COVID-19, it looks like a soft genocide for a variety of populations, for people who are incarcerated, African Americans, Native Americans. But out of all of these groups, it really is just Native Americans who have firsthand experience with biological warfare waged against them intentionally. And Desiree, when you see the lack of federal response in making sure that Native communities have the equipment, have the testing, have the resources for them to deal with people who are infected with COVID-19. I mean, the neglect, without question, is intentional. I can't even say it seems intentional. No, it is intentional, without any question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the United States, one of the ways that they attack Native people is actually under-resourcing the things that we need and then over-resourcing things that we don't need, right? So when you talk about biological warfare, I was at the Standing Rock camps for almost 8 months out of the 9-month occupation. They were spraying us with some kind of something out of planes, even back then, in 2016, using that camp as a experimental ground for whatever it is they were spraying on people. And so they'll over-resource things that benefit them, but then under-resource things like Indian Health Service. Or in Colorado, where I live, Governor Polis recently just cut Medicaid, which funds Indian healthcare here in Denver, by $182 million, saying that, or just ushering in like austerity when what we need is for him and all of the governors to stop giving bailouts to corporations. A lot of things that impact Native people, it ripples outward. So we're usually the canary in the coal mine. I don't like that analogy because resource extraction language is, everywhere. But I think we really see the United States over-resourcing things that harm Native people and then under-resourcing what we actually need, which is healthcare, housing, food security, bodily sovereignty, and then state sovereignty of our nations.
Guys, we have a lot of comments coming in. Let me read some of them to you. 206 War Eagle says the CARES Act, that ain't got the Native brothers and sisters what they need intentionally. That is correct. What's another comment we have here? From Mr. 626667. Truth is that all of America needs to understand. I think he's talking about some of the points that were made earlier in the conversation. And Bald Eagle says, so it's okay for the government to set up checkpoints against we the people, but when someone else does it, there's a problem? Yeah, there is a problem, apparently, according to the governor of South Dakota. Desiree, I wanted to come back to something that you said about resource extraction. And we know that the COVID-19 pandemic is being used not only by corporations, but by the federal government, namely the Trump administration, to push through a lot of foul shit where they think that people aren't looking and or paying attention. And some of that has to do with mining and mineral extraction from the lands of Native Americans. Would one of you be able to speak to that? I'm sure all three of you can speak to it from three different perspectives, because I know this is not just happening to one tribe in one region. I mean, this is pretty much anywhere where the Native peoples are. These corporations backed by the federal government are just really chomping at the bit to get at the natural resources on your lands and not give a shit about the environmental impact that it leaves behind.
Yeah, they're definitely using this as an opportunity to just make a grab at resources out of the land, because folks are quarantined at home, that means water protectors and land defenders are less likely to show up. In Colorado, the oil and gas industry is running rampant. They're setting up new man camps, which are a nightmare for Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirits who go missing or murdered. They're taking advantage of folks being home because they're going unchallenged. The courts being hemmed up the way that they are, there's no access for United States citizens and just people who live here, whether they're documented or not. There's no access to the government. They are doing whatever they want, which is par for the course since Columbus was found lost at sea in 1492. If one analogy that I really like and reminder is that Columbus came with 3 ships, all named after women. On those ships were men, younger men who would survive a trip like that. They had no elders, so no one to remind them of the past. They had no women or any non-men, period, to round out their approach and give them accountability. And they had young men, but no children to remind them of the future. So who landed in the Arawak territory in the Caribbean are young men. So we've got a country now that, fast forward hundreds of years, embodies that personality of an unaccountable, sexually aggressive wealth hoarder. So if you look at it within the context of that, and then also understand there's this thing called the Doctrine of Discovery, which was out of Rome, which basically deemed anyone who was not Judeo-Christian as a savage or a lost soul, lest they convert. It was fine to massacre them. That still happens in every level of governance, every single level. So if you are viewed as a savage, if you are unsaved, if you are not under the control of the crown, now it's the crown of capitalism, you are disposable fodder just to be thrown away. That's why what we're seeing in Denver right now is our governor is housing the houseless, the unsheltered relatives in the Western Stock Emporium, putting the women in the cattle show area on top of a Superfund, which is like toxic soup beneath it. So they're breathing in Superfund dust. Women for show. They want us to be part of the reminder that we are all subjugated. We can free think, but we are forced under the system and we will comply. So understanding some of the historical precedent that has been set by these documents a long time ago about who landed on the shores and how that applies to today is a real help in understanding when you're seeing injustice now. It all starts to make sense once you really start to dig into it.
Oh, wow, Desiree, you're really tapping into some of my racial justice fantasies, right? One of my fantasies is that I have a time machine and I go back 500 years. And when I encounter Native people of the Caribbean and Central and South America and here in the United States, listen, when y'all see the ships and the pale faces on the ships, chop their heads off. Don't give them a chance to get off the boat. As soon as you see them, chop their heads off, because they don't mean nothing nice coming over here to try to talk to the Native people of this continent. But Jen, you said that you're Native from Oklahoma, and I know not only the Cherokee but the Osage Nation in Oklahoma, excuse me, have been dealing with the prevalence of fracking in Oklahoma, causing earthquakes, man-made earthquakes that have been directly impacting Native lands there. Talk to us about the environmental shit that Oklahoma and the federal government are trying to force through, even more so using COVID-19 as an excuse.
Yeah. I both love and hate my home. I think that there are a lot of really amazing things about where I spent most of my childhood, but there's also a lot of really fucked up things too. it really doesn't matter what the issue is. Anytime you talk about Oklahoma, we're always on the wrong side of whatever the issue or the statistics are. We have so many pipelines, for example, that route through Oklahoma. It's absurd. If you look at a map of the pipeline system and proposed pipelines, so many of them go through Oklahoma. There's a small town called Cushing that's known as the pipeline crossroads of the world. But the fracking for me, that's just one piece. Kind of like Desiree said, you got to see the history of it. So, my people, our ancestral lands are in the Southeast and cover either parts of or entirety of what is now known as Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama. And just over the time of all the different colonizers we had, our amount of land just kept shrinking and shrinking. And the U.S. wanted to expand large agricultural business in the Southeast, and that meant removing us. So the vast majority of us were eventually moved on the Trail of Tears to then Indian Territory, now present day Oklahoma. We were told, okay, this is your land now. And, they sent all us natives there because they didn't see it as farmable land. It was land that they saw no use for. But not even 100 years later, the federal government said, hey, never mind. We have, capitalist use for this land now. So we're taking it back. So that's part of why my people don't have a reservation. We have something called allotment land. But yeah, in Oklahoma, it was the over farming of the cotton crops, and that's what caused the Dust Bowl. That was a human-made disaster. Now, you've got the fracking. Oklahoma is now the most seismically active state in the continental U.S. I know I grew up with tornadoes. I grew up with ice storms. I didn't grow up with earthquakes. And I went home last year, I believe, and I was actually in the middle of a panel on the connections of reproductive justice and environmental justice. And in the middle of the panel, we had an earthquake. And it was because of fracking. And I think people don't understand the depths of resource extraction and the way that this can all look. And that, yes, we need to think about whatever that pipeline or mining project is, but we also have to think about it on the larger scale. We can see throughout central Appalachia, the gas industry is really trying to build this 400-mile petro hub corridor where it's pipelines, it's fracked gas powered plants. It's the cracker plants that take the gas and make the plastic. So we always have to think about these larger connections of these projects and what's happening. And then on some indigenous lands, the other issues are big ag. Large scale chicken farms are a potential pollution source for the water within Cherokee Nation boundaries. Large scale agriculture is impacting indigenous people throughout South America. So yeah, we need to think small, but we also have to think on that bigger scale and find a way to fight, and also to see the root causes of these things. Like, it's not just greed, like that's a big part of it, but there's a reason why certain people are impacted more by resource extraction and capitalism than other people. And I think it's really important to point out, as a disabled person, that Native people actually have the highest rates of disability and chronic illness in this country. And much of that is preventable. Much of it is a result of these projects on our lands. It's the result of the violence that we suffer. And as I believe it was Desiree who mentioned, these large scale projects, they also bring a lot of sexual violence to our communities. It's not just, they're polluting the land, they're taking the land, but they're kidnapping our women and our children and our two-spirits. Our people are going missing and murdered. And that's actually why I'm wearing red today. You kind of see my bandana is in honor of our missing relatives. So there's just so much to it that we have to think about, that I think a lot of Americans and just people around the world don't quite understand about the situation of Indigenous people. And to Johnny's point earlier, I believe it was Johnny who said that we're tested on, we're kind of a lab. It was a year or two ago, maybe, Trump started talking about giving SNAP beneficiaries the blue apron style boxes. Well, all of us natives were like, no, don't go for it, because we already get those things. They're called commodity boxes. So it really is like, if you want to see the direction a colonizing nation's going to go, look at how they treat their indigenous people and know that eventually you and yours are going to be treated the same way.
Yeah, they templatized it with us.
They really did. And it's kind of funny because Jen brought up the boxes and, so many people were like, oh, this is outrageous. And I'm sitting there like, y'all realize that natives have been dealing with this already. And also, in my mind, I'm looking at the quarantines when they started putting people, putting these stay at home orders in place. I was thinking, the easiest fix to this is commodities. Make sure your citizens at least have the basics that they need to get through this, because you look at how other countries are tackling this. And I have a cousin who lives in South Korea, and they get a grocery box and they get sanitizing wipes, they get masks, they get fruit, they get, a lot of staples that they need just for everyday living. And that's something that the government has provided for the citizens. And even then, in some buildings, they have people in place who check on the people who are living there in the buildings, making sure that they have what they need. And if there's somebody who's disabled or immunocompromised, they go out and do the shopping for them. And I'm looking at, how we've kind of tackled this, and it's been very much everybody for themselves. And, being Native, we're very communal people. And you see how our communities have chosen to address this. We've set up checkpoints, but also there's a lot of mutual aid within Native communities right now. And not just within Native communities, but outside of Native communities as well. And that is such a wonderful thing to see, because so many times when we're talking about, dismantling capitalism, people are asking, well, what are your solutions? Like, how do you see this happening? How do you see this? Well, this mutual aid that we're seeing throughout the nation, with people making sure that people have groceries or have somebody to go grocery shopping for them, and making sure that, they're helping people with rent or pay bills, fundraising for all these different causes, and just being there in the community. You're seeing one of those solutions in action. You're seeing that there is a better way for us to exist. And for Native people, that is the way we existed before colonization. We took care of each other. All of us had a role within our society. None was more important or less important than another. And we made sure that everybody had what they need. And we all, looked out for one another. And that's how we survived colonization, was because we made sure that nobody was treated as if they were expendable. Even now, we're not looking at our elders like, okay, well, they're old, so, it's okay if they die. And we're not looking at our youth as, well, they depend on us for care, so they're expendable. We don't think of people that way, because each of us are important for our survival. We all carry a lot of knowledge, a huge part of our culture, our language, traditions. We have a lot of potential, and we recognize that in each other, and we honor that. And so you see this mutual aid. You see the way Native communities are pulling together to make sure that the children are fed, to make sure that elders have what they need. It's such a wonderful thing to see, because we're seeing solutions in action. We don't need to live within a capitalist society. We don't need to be all for, just looking out for your own self, which is part of the reason, we're in the mess that we are right now, because so many people are like, well, as long as my rights, as long as my freedom is preserved, then who cares about anybody else? I don't want to wear a mask. I don't want to stay home, and they're not looking at the community. They're not looking at making these small changes just for the betterment of our entire society, to make sure that we're protecting, our neighbors, and not just our neighbors, but our own loved ones. And it's so disheartening to see that. But that's also what happens when you live and you exist within a nation like America that is founded on capitalism, that has all these oppressive power structures that have been put in place, with that have just kind of made it seem like, it's like there's nothing better. Like, without it, we can't exist. But there's ways. Our communities have our own ways, not just Native communities, but I see it in a lot of other communities of color as well, that they have systems in place for their own communities, to make sure that they're taken care of. And, I just keep seeing these systems grow. And, now we're in a pandemic, and now we're getting to see some of these solutions, some of these ideas in action, and they're proving that they work. We can look out for each other. We can make sure we have what we need. And there are just better ways to exist than what we were before, because people want to go back to normal. And I'm thinking, no. I'm glad that normal is over, because it has really shown us just how toxic the environment that we've been living in really is. So I'm looking forward to, what comes next. I find it really hard to be hopeful right now, because, I'm seeing the impact that it has on Native communities. But at the same time, I also acknowledge that there is an opportunity for us to do better. And yeah, it's going to be a struggle, but, honestly, I do believe that we have an opportunity right now where, we've already shown that there are better ways. So now we can keep that going and bring other people on board. And I think that there is a little silver lining down the road. I just right now, it's just really hard to kind of really visualize exactly how we get there. But I know that, there are better ways to exist and that we can do it.
Yeah. I'm seeing how our communities have come together. I mean, Cherokee Nation, when we had to close our casinos, casinos are one of the biggest money makers for the tribes who have them. And it's really even just kind of a legal loophole that we were even able to have casinos. But I digress. When Cherokee Nation closed our casinos, they continued to pay the workers. I think that's really important. We're looking at huge corporations that have ungodly amounts of money, and they won't pay their workers. They won't pay them well. They won't give them benefits. They won't give them, the PPE, the personal protective equipment. There's so much they won't do. But then I look at my nation of, only 370,000 people. And, we are actually one of the larger employers in the state of Oklahoma, and we're paying our workers who, while they have to be home quarantined, it's a different way as possible. And I think, just speaking as a Native person, a big part of that is also just getting the United States government to take their foot off our necks so that we can care for our people. The U.S. likes to go back and forth on sovereignty. If it comes to making sure we have clean running water, electricity, we have high-speed broadband access, roads, if any of that, oh no, we're sovereign nations, it's our responsibility. But now if you want to come in and build a pipeline, you want to come in and take the land for some large-scale mining project or something, well, then we're no longer sovereign. And I think, just going back to earlier in the show, we were talking about the roadblocks. For me, it's not, or excuse me, not the roadblocks, but the checkpoints. And checkpoints, not roadblocks. For me, it's not even just that issue. It's how the government and corporations as well like to just pick at our sovereignty. I mean, the Goldwater Institute got involved in the legal case for ICWA, which is the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was put in place because so many of our Native children were being stolen from us. Well, they got in on it saying, oh, this is really racist and we have to get rid of ICWA. And it's like, well, the Goldwater Institute doesn't do anything around children or Native people. This is just a way for them to try to strip tribal sovereignty.
It's population control. Also, if you really start to dig down in it, it's population control and class warfare. What we're seeing in the street. This is like how class warfare works. You take away people's ability to have access to healthy foods, to education, to all kinds of things. And there are natural outcomes, which Native elders have been saying for hundreds of years. And so now the effects of what they have been warning about for so long are being felt. So I think there is a point to be made that this is how population control works by the capitalist, elite, the global billionaires, the 2,100 global billionaires. This is how they handle the population. They need the GDP to go up. That means they need less people here. So it's all about wealth. And this is being viewed, this coronavirus is being viewed as an opportunity to just take a few people out, but it's our relatives. It's wrong, it's unethical, it's inhumane. So, when we're discussing it, I really am encouraged when I hear young people talking about class warfare, population control, how to use the interdependent nature of our communities in our favor, because there are so many more of us than the 2,100 global billionaires. So many more. I appreciate that this show is happening too, because ultimately, indigenous people to this continent know how to survive diseases from other continents, how to survive capitalism on this continent. And ultimately, there is going to become a shift, or a shift is happening now, where people are starting to respect the knowledge that indigenous people hold in how to survive all of this. Because the fact of the matter is, we will outlive this. Just like we've outlived the other colonizers, just like we've outlived all the other diseases that have come. At the end of the day, we're going to outlive all of that. So, it's good that people have ears to hear these things.
I want to get back to something Johnnie said. Johnnie, when you were talking about the elected officials who suggested that elderly members of the community should just sacrifice themselves for the good of the economy, and there's more to life than living. This is what the Lieutenant Governor of Texas said out his mouth, not just once, but I believe he said it 2 times. He doubled down on it. And I'm thinking to myself, who would make such a suggestion? You know who? A ghoul, a vampire, a bloodsucker, a person
Someone who wants their servant back.
It's so true, because, I'm glad that in light of this, you see so many people saying, eat the rich, because the veil's being pulled back. Because before this, there was such celebrity worship. And, you see people with wealth and you admire them. You want to be like them. You're listening to them. And I've been having conversations with my roommate for the last couple of days about Joe Rogan and some of the hypocrisy that we see going on, that he makes fun of people who are wearing masks. And he's saying, we need to reopen the economy. We need to do this. We need to do that. But at the same time, he's not practicing what he's preaching, because he's also getting tested every day. He has access to his own personal test, his own personal doctors. And that, when you see his podcast, he's telling his buddies, oh, if you need tests, come on over. I got you covered. And he's also been able to provide his family with, enough resources to where they don't have to leave quarantine. But yet he's encouraging other people, like, we need to reopen the economy. We need to get people back to work. We need to do this. And a lot of that you're hearing is coming from people who don't necessarily work. They're not the people who are out on the front lines. Their wealth is dependent upon other people doing the work. And they're the ones who are like ready to sacrifice whoever it takes in order to secure their own wealth and to secure their own being. And they're preaching this. And because of the way that so many people, clung to Trump because he was a businessman, it's the same thing. They're really relying on people to kind of think like, oh yeah, we need to get back to work. Because the fact is, they're not looking out for our economy. They're not looking out for the people. They don't give a crap about the state of our nation. They're only looking out for their own wealth. And they want us to be able to sacrifice ourselves for their own well-being. And, you see, it's so ridiculous, but I'm actually glad that this pandemic came about, because it's starting to pull the veil back, and people are starting to realize, like, these people are full of shit. And, they need to just kind of stay in their lane. And it's kind of funny too, because I've seen so many people who were previously what people would consider liberal celebrities or liberal people who are rich, after this pandemic, and, now that they've not been able to work or their business has been shut down, they've really kind of jumped to the other side, and kind of really become, more like Republican parrots, I guess you would say, in terms of, just like, oh man, we got to look out for this. We need to look out. We need to make sure people are working. And it's like, you know what? We don't need to. And, like, there are a lot of businesses. There are a lot of people who are really scared about not having the resources they need. And, I'm looking at this like, guys, why are we trying to go back to work? Why are we trying to do this? Why are we fighting against each other when what we should be doing is fighting against the government who has denied businesses viable solutions to protect their businesses? They have the loans, but so many of these small businesses aren't getting the loans that they need. And why are we giving them loans and not grants? And, the loans too are coming with some unrealistic payback expectations. And even with rent should be canceled, and not just rent for renters, but, mortgages for building owners. Like that should all be done, canceled. That way, not all of us kind of take a hit, but we're not sacrificing someone for the sake of someone else, which is basically everything that has happened is set up that way. We're sacrificing the poor for the sake of the rich who are getting these loans, who are getting more money than anybody else. We got $1,200. Well, not all of us. But a lot of people just got $1,200 and they're expecting people to survive this pandemic on this. And it's like, guys, no. You see what other countries are doing. Other countries have canceled rent. Other countries have made sure that the businesses that have shut down, have means to open up again and not have to worry about going bankrupt. And that's what our country should be doing. But instead, they're looking like, oh, we're just going to give you crumbs and expect you to be happy with that. And it's kind of like hook, line, sinker, because so many of the people have kind of really taken this like, oh, this is why we need to work. This is why we need to open up. This is why we need to sacrifice each other. Because if not, we're going to lose our businesses. We're going to lose our homes. We're not going to have. And, I'm terrified of this. The same things of like not having a roof over my head because I've been homeless. I know what that's like and I never want to do that again. So I know that fear. I know what it's like to not have food security or to wonder where, your next meal is coming from. I know it's a scary thing, but, so many people live with this fear every day, whether or not there's a pandemic. And what this pandemic has shown is that there are solutions and that there is money to address these problems. The problem is that money is not being put aside for the people of the nation. It's being put forth for the corporations, for the people that the billionaires. It's for just a very small percentage and not for everyone else. And, it kind of really shows how far we've strayed from trying to be a nation that's for the people, by the people, because now it's just for the corporations, for the rich, everybody else be damned. And, I'm glad this pandemic happened because like I said, it's pulling that veil back and, it's kind of getting people, ignited again, like, oh, we got to do better. We can do better. We will do better. And I'm really glad for that because, there's just so much wrong going on right now. And it's just ridiculous. And it's so infuriating. And sometimes like, I don't even have the words to put into like, to even express what I feel about this because it's just so overwhelming. But thank God this pandemic happened in a way because now we know that there are better ways and we know that there's money, that all these things that they tell us it's not possible. Well, it is possible because they've done so much within such a small time frame that we know now that they're just kind of full of crap and they're just like stringing us along. So I think that as a people, we need to demand better. We need to demand more. And we need to hold these politicians. I don't care if they're Republican or Democrat. I don't care. We need to hold them all accountable because honestly, the entire condition of our nation is just because of the pissing contest that they have between each other. They're not looking out for the nation. They're not looking about, creating a balance within government. They're looking at who they can screw over more. Republicans get in power, they want to screw the Democrats. Democrats get in power, they want to screw the Republicans. They're all the same thing. They're supposed to be working for the people, and they're not. I'm in the lane of I think it's time that we need to abolish both parties and find a new way. Even if we have to go to American Idol way of voting for presidents, like that is so much better than having to choose between Republicans and Democrats because when we do that, we're always forced between choosing the lesser of two evils. And right now, you look at our candidates for president and it's just like, yeah, we're screwed. America's gone down the toilet and we have no one to blame but ourselves.
been down the toilet, ladies, been down the toilet. And it's so, it's amusing in a way. And first of all, Johnnie, I appreciate you making that sentiment that you're sort of glad that the pandemic came about, because it has revealed quite a lot about the chasms in our society in regards to inequality, in regards to making sure that the entirety of this nation has some sort of a social safety net. Because I feel similarly. I mean, you step outside, you can breathe the air, like everything is clean. And I am so regretful and sorrowful about, the tens of thousands of people who have already lost their lives as a result of poor planning and poor execution by our federal government as a result of the pandemic. But what it has shown us is what is possible, right? There can be a better here coming out of this, and we definitely cannot get back to normal. But ladies, as you see, it's already 12 after the hour. I know I've kept you a little longer than I intended, but I did want to go around the horn, and I wanted each of you to answer. How can people who are not part of the Native community, how can we best be allies to your community?
That's an easy one. That's so easy. Listen to Indigenous people. It's the simplest way to be an ally is just to listen.
I'll go a step further and say, not just listening, but stop throwing us in as an afterthought. I've noticed since Standing Rock, in some community organizing circles, it's like, oh, we have to do a land acknowledgement. Oh, we're going to throw Indigenous into our language, but where the hell are the Indigenous people? Like, we are almost never brought in the beginning of projects. Almost no one ever comes to us to talk to us and consult us. It's like, well, we're going to go on ahead and do our thing, and I guess we'll let a token Native or two in. And that's not okay. If you really want to stand with Indigenous people, whatever you're working on, you need to bring us in from the very beginning. We cannot be an afterthought. That is unacceptable. And I'm also personally just tired of non-natives talking over us instead of listening to us. You don't have to like everything we say, but for example, like Elizabeth Warren, us Cherokee people, we've been saying for a long time, she's not one of us, but a lot of non-natives, mostly white folks, like to just keep talking over us, saying, well, how do you know? Who are you to say? And my response is always, well, who the hell are you to say who's really Native? Who are you to speak on the Native experience? So that's another really important thing, is that you need to remember that Indigenous people are different. We're not all the same. We're not a monolithic people. Our experiences are different. Our languages, our culture is different. So when you bring us in to work with you, or when you come to us to work with us, you need to remember that just because, oh, hey, this Lakota person said they're okay with X, Y, and Z, does not mean that this Choctaw person over here is going to be okay with it. Like, we're all different, and that needs to be respected. Just like our sovereignty needs to be respected. And I think, I can't recall who mentioned it, I think Johnnie Jae, but you also need to remember that when you look at the issues, you need to look at how Native people are counted or how we're not counted. And that per capita piece is so important. If you look at, say, incarceration rates, Native people don't ever really get, we're rarely talked about. Well, we actually have huge incarceration rates when you break it down per capita. So I think that's the other thing to remember, is that you need to look at how these issues are impacting us on this per capita way, and recognize also that when we're over here saying, what about us? What about us? That doesn't mean that we're saying you don't matter. That doesn't mean that we are disparaging other marginalized communities. It's that we're standing up and trying to be heard and trying to save our people as well.
Who else didn't get in on how to be an ally? I look at the screen sometimes. I can't remember who didn't answer. Johnnie, did you let us know how people who are not Native Americans, how best to ally to the Native American community?
Yeah, I said listen to Indigenous people, because
then it wasn't Desiree.
Yeah.
Sorry. Desiree, do you want to tell us?
Yeah, I think just taking the time to educate yourself and to actually approach things in a manner where you're like, I'm going to deprogram myself out of the capitalist, cisgendered, heteropatriarchal, capitalist cult. Like those sorts of things are really important. Understanding root causes, but doing the due diligence to understand the true history of what has happened with Native people on this continent goes a long way. And then when you encounter misinformation or disinformation, like someone being like, oh, Native people are extinct, or, oh, any kind of like racist trope that you might come across. I think of an NFL team with a slur for a name. Challenge those things. Like, if you know that something is wrong and it has to do with Native people, speak it. You don't need to lecture Native people. Go lecture your own people. Go get your own skin folk. Go retrieve them and be like, I love you enough to tell you the truth. Because there's so much misinformation out there. There's the American education system is a complete failure when it comes to Indigenous issues or actual fact in education around the history of this continent. But go and speak. We don't have numbers when it comes to the broad population on this continent. We don't, because of sustained genocidal attempts. So we really need folks to educate yourself and then go speak it, like correct the record. There's just go correct the record when you have folks around you that are on one that's some bullshit.
Ladies, before we close out the show, we have a piece written by Jen Deerinwater, which will be going live on therealnews.com, I believe tomorrow. Jen, can you give us a preview about what you wrote about?
My apologies. So I wrote about South Dakota Governor Nome's objections to some of the tribal nations in South Dakota who have checkpoints on their roads. And so you're going to get to learn about that issue, but also read about it and learn about how it connects to larger issues of Native genocide and tribal sovereignty. So keep an eye out for it, and read and share it, please, when it comes out.
And listen, everybody who's watching, here at The Real News, we are trying to expand our voices perspective, right? So we are trying to hear from more Indigenous voices, more Indigenous journalists, Indigenous organizers. So I believe all that information is on our website, therealnews.com. But our ability to fund Indigenous journalism here at our media outlet is funded in part by the R&M Lang Foundation. So we definitely want to thank them for putting their money where their mouth is, basically, and understanding that people need to be paid, okay? If you want people to report and you want to get a different perspective, especially from marginalized communities, marginalized people need that Skrilla, baby. So thank you very much for dropping us some coin, R&M Lang Foundation. Well, gang, we have been rocking and rolling here on Stir Crazy for a strong hour and 20 minutes. I cannot thank our panel enough. Jen Deerinwater, Johnnie Jae, Desiree Kane. This was amazing, gang. And you guys can't see all the comments and all the chat and all that, but just know everything was popping in the chat and in the comments. People were loving the show, loving the perspective that you bring. And I certainly hope to have you guys on here regularly, if possible, because y'all were dropping nothing but straight truth and straight knowledge. And more of us need to hear this perspective from your community more often, so we're not doing like Desiree said, thinking about the indigenous perspective as an afterthought. No, it needs not to be an afterthought. Right there at the table, first one sitting at the table, matter of fact. So I'd like to thank all three of you for taking the time to hang out and have this fantastic discussion with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Wado, thank you.
And gang, that's another episode of Stir Crazy. We appreciate you guys getting it on and popping. Steely Steve, the Highlander treatment. I saw that, sir. It made me smile. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm your host, Kim Brown. We'll see you on Monday. All right, gang, have a fantastic weekend and stay safe. Have a good one.